Hey,
Hi, I'm Dr. Cindy Dupuy. I have a PhD in learning disabilities. I do diagnostic evaluations, advocacy, and intervention. I'm also an adult with dyslexia and dysgraphia.
hi, my name is Kim Sharman. I work with kids with dyslexia, dysgraphia, ADHD, and other learning issues, and I work with kids from age kindergarten through college.
Excellent. Okay, so we are going to talk about the difference between the WISC and the WAIS. Okay, do you remember what the WISC stands for?
Yes.
Tell me.
Uh, Weschler Intelligence Score for Children,
Scale.
Scale for
You were
Children.
so close. Okay,
Yes.
you remember what the
And,
WAIS stands for?
Weschler Adult Intelligence Scale.
Yay!
Hey.
You're getting your acronyms. Okay,
Yeah.
so the WISC is on version 5 and the WAIS is on version
Four.
4. Okay, so when they updated the WISC 5, they did something really significant, which is they cut down the number of subtests. So evidently people were complaining that it took too long to administer.
Oh,
So they
brother.
chopped 3 subtests.
Okay.
Now, the irony in that is I see a lot of school psychologists still go ahead and do all 10 subtests and
Hmm.
get all of the index scores. Technically, you don't have to. I don't find that those 3 optional subtest scores do something dramatically different for me because of the depth and breadth of the evaluation I already do. But occasionally I will add them in. Okay. But the WAIS has 4 index scores. Okay, so we're going to see parallels between those. And then the other thing that we should talk about really fast is age range. Do you remember the age range for the WISC?
Yeah, the WISC is 6 to 16 and the WAIS is 16 plus.
Right. So they always overlap a year. Do you remember the name of the IQ test for little kids?
Oh, the whoopsie doopsie, the
Whipsy.
whoopsie.
Um, so that's for preschool kids, and it actually goes from, I want to say like 3, I hesitate to say this because I may get that wrong, all the way up to about 8, it covers age 6.
3 to
Okay.
6. Okay.
So they always overlap by a year.
Okay.
Okay. Why would somebody get a WAIS?
Well, if you're in high school and you're getting reevaluated or you're getting evaluated for the first time, before you go to college, colleges require that
Some
in order to,
colleges do. Some colleges
yeah.
want an adult IQ.
Okay. Oh,
Um,
they want adult IQ. That's right.
right.
And
Okay.
um, also if you've never been diagnosed and all of a sudden
Yeah. And
figure
I
it out.
evaluate college students. Matter of fact, I just completed an evaluation on a college student who had never been evaluated and finished his freshman year,
Wow.
and stuff got missed. So, but just a determined kid who kind of nose to the grindstone, got what he needed to get done. Um, so the other thing that the WAIS is used for is when we do neuropsych evals on adults, looking for things like dementia or cognitive decline or traumatic brain injury or whatever else.
I didn't know that.
They also use it in legal situations where you're evaluating competency for an individual to stand trial.
I see.
So if you have somebody who has an intellectual disability, they'll use a WAIS to
Hmm.
evaluate to determine where their IQ is, because that then affects their ability to make decisions and understand information that is presented to them.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Now, we've also had a discussion about should IQ score change?
Right. I asked the question, would a kid's IQ change from age 10 to age 18?
And my answer to that is depends on the individual. So, kids who, let's say you got evaluated in first or second grade and you had language issues, so you had a diagnosed learning disability in receptive expressive language disorder,
Mhm.
and you got intensive speech language services, and you came back later and you did a WAIS, those speech language services could affect your ability to perform better on the test.
Mhm.
Similarly, if you're a kid with dyslexia and dysgraphia, uh, not so much the dysgraphia piece, but the dyslexia piece, if you do structured literacy, which would include things like word origins, When you hit the vocabulary on the WAIS, you could use word origins to help you figure out definitions of words that you've never heard before. Okay, so we do see some variability, and within that, and we'll do a whole thing on confidence intervals. We'll do a whole video on what is a confidence interval and how does it work. So that kind of gives you the overview. Like in a typical adult, or in a typical individual that doesn't necessarily have learning issues, we would expect some level of consistency. I might score a few points lower, I might score a few points higher, but overall it should be fairly stable. I see shifts. I also forgot to mention this. If you have ADHD, and the first time you took an IQ test, you were not medicated, I've mentioned that I see a shift of 7 to 30 IQ points on and off stimulant medication.
Which can take you from below average to superior. And people don't realize that.
Yeah.
When Cindy tests, she always makes sure that the kid, if she suspects it, she has them get evaluated first.
Yes. I always check that up front because it's commonly missed. So if you have a kid who is determined and motivated or super supported, often the attention deficit will be missed.
And it's a huge impact, and people don't realize what a huge impact it is.
Yeah, it dramatically changes how you view the individual, both for good and bad, but we'll talk about that another day. But let's kind of dive in now and let's take a look at the major differences between the two. And I am going to pop in and share this PowerPoint, and it's super stripped down, and my apologies, it's not fancy schmancy, but I don't think we need it. So the major difference between the WISC V and a WAIS are the index scores. Okay, so the WISC has 5 index scores, and we're going to take a look at what those index scores cover, and the WAIS has 4 index scores. Okay, and you can see them there. So you've got verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning is on the WAIS. On the WISC, it's visual, spatial, and fluid reasoning. Both have working memory and both have processing speed. So, okay, so let's talk about the verbal comprehension. So you've got similarities, 1-to-1, vocabulary, 1-to-1. Information is optional on the WISC, but required on the WAIS. Okay. Comprehension is optional on both of those. Now, do you know what an optional subtest is for?
I thought optional subtests was for if you had an erroneous situation where you were testing on a regular subtest score, you could substitute it.
Yeah. So normally you have to have a declared reason as to why you're doing a substitution. They also have, so on the WISC V, they have some comprehensive scores. So you can get a comprehensive verbal score, meaning you administer all 4 subtests, it averages them, and it gives you an index score. And so I've occasionally done that with kids with super, super high verbal abilities. I will go in and do all 4 subtests and report a comprehensive verbal index score, which includes all of those. Okay.
And you're doing that because it's so extraordinary. You want to make sure to get an accurate reflection.
Right. And I want others to understand those unusual abilities.
I see.
Okay. Now, I do want to point out that the vocabulary used on the WISC is not the vocabulary used on the WAIS. And the similarities items are not the same between the 2 tests, nor is information, nor is comprehension. Okay. So now let's get to the really interesting one, which is visual, spatial, fluid reasoning on the WISC versus perceptual reasoning. Okay. So we've talked about visual spatial, Kim. What's visual spatial?
The ability to understand how things are put together and the ability to go from part to whole to part or something like that.
Yeah, it's how do things fit in space? Why could they go together? How would they work together, right? And fluid reasoning?
The fluid reasoning is your ability to oh, the matrix reasoning. It's be able to understand. Is this the algebra one? Like
Figure weights is the algebra one. Matrix
oh,
reasoning is, do you recognize patterns? Can you
patterns,
see
patterns.
sequential patterns where it just goes across, or can you work in a 2x2 or 3x3 matrix? Okay.
And this concept, what surprised me with that is this concept of pattern applies not just to shapes, it applies to life, to history, to science, to economics, to everything.
Yeah. Now, so you'll notice block design is block design. Again, items are difference between the two tests. Visual puzzles and visual puzzles. Okay. Matrix reasoning and matrix reasoning. Okay.
Mhm.
To give you context as to how we got here, the WISC III had two major indexes. It had a basically verbal IQ and a non-verbal IQ. They had a verbal composite, and then they had a perceptual reasoning that combined all the non-verbal components. And they realized there was some inherent fallacy in their defining of those elements because there's so much subtlety within that. That's where they began to break things out and create these individual index scores underneath. Does that kind of make sense? Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you'll also notice that you have figure weights on the WISC V and you have figure weights on the WAIS IV. But then the WAIS IV also has something called picture completion. And picture completion is you look at a picture and there's some element missing, and you have to be able to identify and characterize what that missing element is. Okay, so you could have, I'm trying to think of an example here.
I read a book about a person who had a brain disorder, and they had the guy try to complete a clock,
mhm.
and he couldn't do it. And they knew that there was something wrong or something was missing.
Yeah, that's a high level neuropsych test, which is great. And you're talking
Oh,
about
that's
some
not the
Oliver
same.
Stockstadt, but it's similar to that. So you might show somebody a clock face and you might have an arrow pointing to a number, but no arm connecting the arrow.
Oh,
And you would have to identify that there was no arm from the center of the clock to the arrow.
I see. Okay.
They've got a couple of futzy ones that they used to have on the WISC IV. They had one that just doesn't work in Seattle, and unfortunately I can't disclose what it is, but drove me nuts. I hated it. So anyhow, you can see kind of the parallels. So you can see that the perceptual reasoning kind of incorporates the visual, spatial, and fluid reasoning in their new construct. Okay. So now let's look at working memory. So again, we have digit span and digit span. On the WAIS, we do a subtest called arithmetic, which is where I give you a verbal story problem. Bob had 8 cookies. He ate 2 of them. How many cookies did Bob have left?
And you do it verbally?
You do it verbally.
Hmm.
And there's no paper and pencil. So you have to hold it all in your head.
Mm.
And the computations get really, really complex.
Mm.
Okay, so you have to be able to hold the math, do it in your head, and then spit it back out.
Mm.
Okay. Then letter number sequencing and letter number sequencing are parallel between the two tests. So that's where I read you a series of letters and numbers, and you have to sequence them, numbers smallest to largest, letters in alphabetical order. So I might say B5 2C. So you would say 2 5
BC.
C. Yeah.
Hmm.
And then you notice here you've got arithmetic on the WISC V, which is parallel to the WAIS, but it's an optional subtest.
Okay.
And then the other big difference is on the WISC V, picture span is one of the 2 that's used to give the working memory index score. And the picture span is you see a series of pictures, you're shown a new page with a bunch of different pictures, and you have to point to the pictures you saw in the same order that you saw them.
Mm.
Okay, so we'll talk about that in another video on another time. Okay. Next one is processing speed, and you will notice it is very parallel. So coding is coding. Here's a number, here's an associated symbol. Down below, you have numbers, translate the numbers into the symbols. How quickly can you do it? Symbol search, you have a target. Do you see a match in an array? If you don't see one, mark no. If you do see one, draw a line through it. And then cancellation is a really different way of looking at that. So on cancellation, they give you two colored shapes at the top. So you might see a purple triangle and a red star. And then you would have to go through and find every example of that as you scan over a page. And they do 2 trials on that. Okay. So you can get, and I apologize, the WAIS should not have parentheses around them because symbol search is required. I copied over and did not correct that. So my apologies on that. Pretend that those brackets are not there. Now, had you noticed the brackets, Kim? Because we forgot to mention them.
Yeah, wasn't quite sure what they meant, but
Oh, well, let's go back and talk about that really quick. So
oh no, it just means that they're optional. We did talk about optional testing.
yeah, so you've got other subtests that you can use for various reasons. Again, letter number sequencing is the optional, and then in processing speed on the WAIS, symbol search is not optional, it's actually required, and symbol search technically comes before coding.
And by optional, you mean substitution or just optional?
You can administer it if you want to. You can also use it for a spoiled subtest.
I see.
So you're giving coding and the fire alarm goes off.
Yes.
Then you could go to symbol search or cancellation and use that and then explain what happened.
Got it.
Or you're doing arithmetic and somebody suddenly gets sick and vomits. Strange things happen. That's just the way it does. Okay. So finally, the similarities. So many subtests are similar when I say content-wise, meaning they're parallel. I give you 2 words and you have to explain the relationship. I give you a vocabulary word, you have to define the word. They calculate a verbal comprehension, they calculate a working memory, and they calculate a processing speed. You can do a full-scale IQ and you can do a GAI, General Ability Index. The difference is on, and my apologies again, I did this way too fast.
That's okay. Verbal comprehension. You mean verbal comprehension, right?
Yes. Oh my gosh.
Okay.
What a dyslexic moment, not verbal compression.
That's okay.
2 versus 3 subtests, and
Yeah.
then the visual spatial fluid reasoning versus the perceptual reasoning. Hopefully that cracks everybody up that the dyslexic can't read and recognize those, which is kind of a classic dyslexic moment. I should have let you look at it before we did this.
That's okay.
But questions? Would you have any questions after seeing all of that, Kim?
Yeah. One of the things that I noticed is that sometimes I receive reports from other people, diagnosticians, and they're using very old WISC tests, or like, and I don't get it. What if people are not using a WISC V or a WAIS IV and they're using like WISC 3 or 2 or WAIS 3 or 4?
Yeah. So the APA sets the standards that you should not be using tests that are considered out of date.
Any range or just?
So normally you have kind of a window of when you retire one test and go into the next. So when the WISC or when the WAIS 5 comes out, the day it comes out, I will purchase it. I keep all of my tests up to date. And I just purchase it when it is available. It is shipped to me.
Why is that important?
Because old norms are not as reliable. So we see
norms.
Can
you explain norms?
Oh, norms is where we look up what an individual scored on a subtest, and it converts to the standard score, the scaled score, to give us a sense of how they're doing overall.
Of the population.
So the population as a whole keeps getting smarter and smarter and smarter. And so when they renorm, that's another reason that your IQ score could go down. So if you took a WISC 5 towards the end of the window before they renormed it, you might have a higher IQ score, and then take
Interesting.
the new WAIS and you might get a lower IQ score because when they re-norm it, when the population gets smarter and more capable, it shows in the new IQ scores.
That's very interesting. So really you should not be using ancient.
Right. So if let's give another example. There's versions of the Gray Oral Reading Test. There's versions of the Kaufman Tests of Educational Achievement. There is the Wyatt, the Wechsler. I don't remember the whole acronym on that one. I just know the Wyatt. We're currently on the Wyatt IV.
So when parents look at their reports,
Sorry, we're on the Wyatt. Hang on, let me double check. I'm saying that. I cannot believe I can't remember this in the
but the
moment.
thing that you're doing right now is what a parent can also do when he or she looks at those reports to identify that all the most recent tests are being used on their student.
Yes, I was correct. We are on the Wyatt IV. It's not one of my favorite tests. I don't use it very often. But if
Okay.
you're using something as old as the Wyatt II, garbage. I
Wow.
will occasionally use an older test because there's nothing parallel currently, but I do explain in my report that the norms are old and need to be viewed with caution.
But those are those academic tests you're doing, or is it on IQ tests you're doing
Oh,
that?
I would never use an old IQ test. Now,
Wow.
yeah. Now, here's our challenge. It is really expensive to update IQ tests. Really, really expensive.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. So the test publishers, it's a 7-year process to
Okay.
update an IQ test.
Huh.
7 years. So just as they're finishing publication on the new IQ test, they are actually typically starting within a fairly short window of time to update the next one.
Wow.
So as they're finishing the WAIS IV, they're probably either coming in to do the new WIPC or they're coming in to do a new WISC.
Hmm.
And ironically, the Stanford Binet is actually getting old.
Hmm.
So, but it is a ton of work because they go back item by item by item. They have to update based on new research of how we understand different ways of thinking and processing and understanding. And so they incorporate that into new tests and they have to give harder and different items. So they have to try out new items and determine whether or not they're sensitive and accurate. I mean, it's just a ton of work.
So they do when they create these new tests, I mean, they are literally doing testing on the population using statistics to ensure that they're getting accurate information as to the new
Yes.
questions and the new norms.
Yes. So for example, the RAML 3, I was part of the norming process for the RAML 3. And so they changed a ton of stuff. I shouldn't say a ton. They changed a number of significant things in the RAML 3, some of which I think made it way better, some of which I'm like, not a huge fan of. But they update the test to reflect what we have learned in the field of psychology, development, education, etc., to reflect that. So let me give you another great example. They used to give on the GORT, the Gray Oral Reading Test, you would read a passage and then you had questions that you had to answer. In prior GORTs, you had a multiple choice format. And what they found is if you administered the GORT, just the comprehension test, without ever having the kids read the passage, they scored the exact same whether or not they had read the passage
Oh my God.
versus just having the questions read to them. So the GORT now has open-ended questions. Again, really significant shift that reflects what research showed to make it a more accurate and effective measure.
Okay. I get it.
And we will stop there for today.
Okay. Thank you.